I believe. But there's a scene where he's in a library, an old Victorian study with Livingston, Henry Livingston. And all the money guys clear out and they're just kind of eyeing each other up and down. And they start comparing scars very nonchalantly. And by the end of the scene, they're both down to their underwear. Just like pointing out, I got this one. There's a bullet hole from Singapore. This is a spear through my face. And then by the end, he says, well, what's that one from? He says, I don't even remember. And they just start laughing to each other. So,
which movie is that?
Mountains of the Moon. Yeah, if you haven't seen it, you should watch it. I think
Mountains of the Moon. Is it an old flick or?
I think it's from the 70s or 80s, so not too old. It's like Mountains of the Moon.
And who are the characters or people we would know?
Richard Francis Burton, and something Speak. I forget Speak's first name.
John Henning Speak.
No, I meant the actors.
Oh. I don't know the actor's name. The actor who plays Speak played Jorah in Game of Thrones, if that means anything to you.
Good.
It's good though, Rob. You'll get a kick out of it if you haven't seen it. You should put it on your list.
Where's the scotch bottle and the glasses?
Yeah.
The vibe. Now it's
I
like
think we
coffee
drank
and
it
water.
all. Yeah. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Adventurers Club of Los Angeles. My name is Alex Shoemate, member number 1210. I'm the current president of the club for a couple more weeks here, and I'm grateful to have everybody here tuning in, both in person and from abroad. We have a very special guest tonight, member Mike Clark, who's here to tell us a little bit about his adventures in Chernobyl. So I think without further ado, I guess you give us a little bit about your background and kind of what's taking you around the world. I know you've traveled over 130 countries and kind of what's inspired you to travel.
Yeah, absolutely. I've always had an interest in travel. I love going around the world. I went to the University of Colorado Boulder. There I majored in anthropology. Always had an interest in cultures. So primarily I started off really traveling, going to different countries to see tribal people. So I saw 20 different tribes across the world on all 6 continents. And after that, started doing a lot of motorcycle traveling, been diving all over the world. I was fortunate I worked for the National Science Foundation as a contractor down in Antarctica, was able to dive down there, and I've just continued to travel since then. So just getting out there, learning about people, meeting different cultures, and traveling all over the world by whatever means possible.
Fantastic. I feel kind of remiss now. We had a gentleman here earlier tonight who already, unfortunately, had to head out a little bit early, but he was asking about diving in Antarctica. And I think you're probably standing 10 feet away from him. I didn't even know you'd had the connection there.
We might have actually talked. I think I did see him when we were here.
Okay, well, there we go. I feel better now. So in your travels then, what was it about Chernobyl? I'm assuming you obviously lived through that entire experience when it was international news. What was your experience, I guess, first living through it, and then what about that experience then inspired you to try and travel there later on?
So 86 is when it happened. It happened in April of 86 after the test went wrong on nuclear reactor 4. So in 86, that would have been my senior year in high school. And you know, back then I don't think I was as into the news as I might be now or what's going on globally, but you know, it was just always kind of an interest of what was out there. This trip came about, we were looking to rent Urals or get Urals when we went into either purchase or rent them in Russia, starting in Moscow, right to St. Petersburg, and then eventually head across the country and go as far east as possible. Logistically, it wasn't working out. It was also coming upon a time that it was starting to get cold, so there was going to be some limitations of what we could do going out to the east. So we decided to go into Ukraine and then afterwards go up to Russia and visit Russia. So going into Ukraine, you know, and researching it, one of the ideas was we knew that the sarcophagus, the new sarcophagus, was being built to cover the reactor. It'd be the last chance to get to see it. We were hoping to also get to enter it. Upon getting there, we set it up. We went through all the different logistics, and then we had set up like to do 2 days in Chernobyl. And it's not quite so simple, or at least it wasn't when I went. I went in 2017. And that was right before the sarcophagus that was being built was done. And with that, we went in and we did all the permissions. You have to have a guide. You have to have someone that's registered, and they take everything from your passport. You fill out numerous amounts of paperwork, and then you get permissions to go. After you get the permissions, you still have to get to the front entrance. When you get to the front entrance, there's a military group there. You go through a number of checks, and then after that, you're inside. And it's just wide open to you. And it's probably just the biggest ghost town that you could ever imagine. And what you're able to see there is pretty spectacular. At that time, there were no limitations on what you could really go in or out of, and that was really what the special thing was.
All right, so real quick, a little bit of background, especially for people who might not have followed the Chernobyl incident as closely. The sarcophagus you're talking about. So after the incident, they built a concrete initial sarcophagus, correct?
Correct.
It's been in place for, I don't know, decades or something like that at this point. And what you're talking about is this new structure. I think the picture we have here is of the old sarcophagus.
This is reactor 4, and that was the last of the towers that was remaining. The sarcophagus that he's mentioning is that originally they had flown helicopters over, and they would drop cement in. And the cover was blown off. When they did the test, they did not have the right protections in place. There was a lot of problems that took place with the individuals that were running it, and they made the mistake, and it dropped, and what happened, there was a massive steam explosion. 2 people were originally killed. That's all. After a period
in the immediate explosion.
After about 3 weeks, I believe the total death toll was 50, and that became with the firefighters and other operators that had come in. But the first one that they did, it was all just cement drops, and they just kept covering it and covering it and covering it. Well, it had leaked over time, and it was seeping radiation again. So what had happened is the international community came together, and they built this new sarcophagus that is on train tracks, and it looks like almost like a dome stadium that you'd see at a football game. And they would eventually roll this over, and it's just a huge silver dome that's over the top, made of cement, metal, and different types of protective materials to keep the reactor 4 contained as it was coming out. So that now is in place, it's fully over it. You can no longer see this reactor in any way. All you would see is that metal dome. So this is one of the last pictures that I took before leaving. I was unfortunate, there were a lot of workers there at that time, and I had hoped to enter into the building. I had brought the right equipment and everything, but could not pay individuals that we would be able to get into it at that time. So we had to enjoy Pripyat, Chernobyl City, and all the surrounding towns, and just see it from the outside. But it was pretty spectacular, and it's pretty overwhelming when you see it for the first time, just realizing what happened there and what took place.
What would the right equipment look like for getting access kind of to the reactor core? And like, what are the radiation levels still at currently the closer you get to the actual reactor?
So inside the reactor, where I was standing outside, the radiation wasn't that strong. So they say, like for Chernobyl itself to go and visit, it's extremely safe. You get about the same radiation dose. On the dosimeter, it reads about 9 as you would on an overseas flight. So you're not getting any extra radiation for the most part. You'll find it in plants, you'll find it in certain areas around the facility, but just standing outside, it's very minimal. Maybe it's a 2, maybe it's a 3. It really is not strong at all. Inside, that's where it can go up pretty quick. I believe that they allow you 1 full hour when you get in there, and that's the travel and all the time going in, but unfortunately we weren't able to do that.
And is that because of specific restrictions on the time of year and the fact they're doing
and
all this
also
work?
the radiation is so much higher as you enter into that terminal.
But so if you did go in, what kind of gear? You mentioned having like all the right gear.
Yeah, so I had a radiation suit. We also had face masks. We would look to use some of the individuals that were on site that were working inside there and also on the sarcophagus that we could potentially get them from, but once again, did not go.
Shoot. Well, let's take a few steps back, I guess. So this big international incident happens, and obviously Chernobyl, just the word and the implications about that place, is not some place that most people would want to travel to. I know that's changed in recent years, and we can talk about that later, about the kind of influx of tourists. But what about that region appealed specifically to you and the type of travel that you like to do? And when did you start to toy with the idea of going there and kind of looking into the logistics of what it would take to get there?
So when we were looking at going to Russia, we had looked at a lot of different unique places that we might be able to see. This was absolutely on the list, but it wasn't priority. And then when things started to change for the amount of time that we could spend in Russia, we decided, let's go to Chernobyl. We wanted to get there, especially before it was covered, to actually see it at that time. Also, tourism, although it was absolutely going on, there were a number of companies operating, it was nowhere near after the movie was made, that was played, that now the amount of visitors, I think, is quadrupled, if not more.
So at the time, it wasn't difficult to get the permissions to go and visit, but maybe that's a different story now.
No, it wasn't difficult, and I don't believe it's difficult now. It's time consuming. So originally when we went, there weren't a lot of people there, and in fact, on the day that I actually went inside to the Pripyat area, it was pouring rain. So we were the only car at the entrance. We basically had the whole place to ourselves.
Wow.
Which was really amazing.
And so the big thing you always hear about Chernobyl and all the famous photographs is that it's a city that's frozen in time. Did you find that still to be the case, kind of exploring around, or does it look like civilization has started to kind of creep back in over the years?
No, it's completely emptied out. They are unable to go back to this zone. I believe it's I don't even know how many hundreds of years before it would be fully cleared. So you have the exclusion zone, you have the military that blocks it, but you have all these apartments and everything, and the rapid evacuation of individuals that were in the city. So you have Chernobyl city, you have Chernobyl, the actual 4 reactors, and then you also have Pripyat. Pripyat was being constructed in the 1970s to basically house all the people that would work at this plant. And Pripyat was just apartment complexes after apartment complexes. And when the reactor had the explosion, I believe it was April 26th, on the 27th, people started to learn more and more about it. And within 36 hours of the initial explosion, that's when they started to evacuate.
Wow.
So buses started coming in, buses started taking people out. People didn't have time to collect a lot of their stuff. So you see anything from pictures, you see furniture, you see appliances, all in these apartments, that things were left just in time. Most of it's in shambles now. Originally when it happened, and for a period of time over probably 2 or 3 years, there was a lot of looting in there, and that's why it has a much more higher level of military presence to protect that. People would take some precious metals or whatever they thought they could sell, and they were selling that, and people were becoming sick outside.
Understood. So when you talk about, and again, I don't know much about radiation and stuff like that, but when you talk about the levels being relatively low, that's all based on the timeline for which you're there, correct? So the idea is that even though the radiation might be sustainable for, I don't know, hours, days, however long you were visiting, that if you were to live there and try and actually make a life there, that over time
it would continue to build. And there are people that live on the outside. There's some smaller villages on the outside. There's a number of elderly people that still live out there. But for the most part, it's, for probably a 30-mile radius, it really is barren. You'll find other small villages, maybe a couple of different people there. But overall, this area is just wide open. It's not inhabitable.
So did you have then a kind of either literal or mental time limit in terms of the amount of time you could spend there and feel comfortable yourself without taking any undue risks?
No, really, it was, you could spend the full day there. And like I had said, the amount of radiation that you would actually gain is on an overseas flight. So it wasn't much. It's just different areas within this. So in this picture here, you can just see that there's just a ton of growth. And there's all kinds of radiation signs and things of that nature. Going down this is where the paths led, and everything has just been let to go. So you have all types of trees, you have plants, you have mosses. Mosses contain the most of the radiation.
Well, that was an interesting thing we were talking about before.
Right.
Is that radiation is not, and again, maybe people already know this, but it's not a consistent thing, that there'd be different pockets of increased radiation, pockets of less radiation, and then certain things like mosses and tree roots and stuff you're talking about that seem to absorb higher levels. So when you put the reader next to it, all of a sudden it would spike up.
Right. So if you went up to a moss, you put the reader on it, the decimeter would take it up to 15, maybe 20. It would spike pretty quickly versus just in regular it'd be 2. But you'd also even going past regular trees, just depending on where it was very random. and you get these little spikes going up and down.
And then what about animals? Because you always hear, I think it's another kind of known mythology surrounding Chernobyl is the mutant animals that supposedly still run around there and are still radioactive. Did you encounter any wildlife?
Did not see any mutant animals. A lot of dogs.
Yeah.
You hear the dogs barking. I heard there's some giant catfish. Didn't see them either when I was at the pond, but have heard about that. And I think I saw it on one of the shows. It was like River Monsters or one of the fishing shows, and I think he was going fishing for catfish there. So
Some
the
radioactive
rumors are
catfish.
still there, and it makes for a good movie.
Yeah, sure. So you're talking about when you first approach the city, you're saying that it starts in with all this kind of overgrowth. I mean, is that kind of growth and nature reclaiming the urban center, is that consistent throughout the city, or does it kind of give way to more kind of just urban areas?
No, it's throughout the whole city. So it was laid out like a typical Soviet city. It's grid in pattern, but the trees have now overgrown everything. They grow inside the buildings. The buildings are completely dilapidated. We decided to go into Pripyat itself because it was pouring rain. So our original plan, and this is one of the picture here, is entering into one of the apartment complexes. And at first you get there, and I'm nowhere near anything of any kind of a nuclear expert, but you have that nervousness about it. Am I gonna get something? I'm touching things. And
Are you wearing any kind of protective gear at this
not
point?
at that time,
Not
no.
even like a basic
no,
kind of
no mask,
filter rebreather,
no.
nothing?
I was wearing a winter hat. I was wearing a jacket, just my boots and jeans. And we started entering in. Well, we got in probably about, I would say, maybe 20 to 30 feet, and water was pouring down from the ceilings, pouring down the walls, and we were walking through puddles, and then all of a sudden, this huge tile from the top broke, and it was in the area right next to us and just splashed us full of water. Water was in my mouth, water was all over my face, my clothes were soaked, I had dust and all of this all over me, and at that point, we just didn't care. So that's when the fun really started.
That's pretty cinematic, though.
It
tile was just
dropped and
waiting
it was
for you.
just all over. And now you're thinking, oh my God, and then it's like, well, I'm already into it. So the previous picture showed that the stairs and how you would enter up, but there's 16 stories to these buildings. And as you go up, you'll see the different apartments, you'll see the things that people had left behind, and then the floors, it's a very unsafe environment because the building is completely falling apart. And you've got water pouring through and the floors are dipping, and we were able to go all the way to the top and get on top of the roof. And on the top of the roof where the tar is, the roof would almost like bend inwards. You could feel as you walked that like, oh boy, I don't want to take another step and go right through.
Yeah.
So it was pretty surreal. And at that point also, we were touching all of the metal, we were climbing up ladders, we were going into rooms and moving stuff because of what I initially said about that water splashing us, the fear was gone.
Yeah.
So the pictures became better, we were able to get into different areas, and we really got to see what we wanted out of the place.
Did you have a guide taking you around, or were you pretty much just left to go where you wanted?
It was basically we could do whatever we wanted. Once we got in and once we tipped the guide and told him exactly what we wanted to do for the day, he pretty much took us where we wanted to go. And he would show us, and then we would just wander around the different halls, looking into places, looking at the different areas and looking for pictures to take. So it was really just us deciding, how we wanted to see the whole town. And it's a full city, so you've got everything. There's hospitals there. This picture is a picture of the aquatic center. It had a basketball court. It was a full gymnasium. You have the schools. You have entertainment and movie theaters, or theaters where there was plays. You'd have, a hospital. There were just so many different buildings to visit. Also the fire department, the police department, all of this was wide open.
Yeah. So I'm curious, I've been to a couple places with kind of torrid histories. I remember one in particular was like Verdun, for example. And you hear people talk a lot about like kind of energies almost. It's kind of a hard thing to even put your finger on, but when people visit places that have these really brutal histories, there's almost something in the air that you can kind of sense that like something bad happened here. And I know this was probably slanted obviously because of the physical destruction you're seeing all over the place. It's this great abandoned city. But did you get any kind of sense? Was there an atmosphere to the place that hit you, or did it feel, what was your feeling going there? Did it surprise you? Was it underwhelming, overwhelming? What was your experience?
No, I would say it definitely surprised you just because of just how vast, and when you think about how quickly the city was cleared out. You know, the chain of events that took place there were 50,000 people that were in Pripyat at the time, and they were evacuated over a couple-day period. Just to have that town evacuate as quick as it was, take your minimal belongings, and you're gone from there, it's pretty overwhelming as you walk through and you see the things that are still in the rooms, and you're just going through an area that will not be inhabited in my lifetime or any lifetime near it, that it's just there, and it's, you know, going to be there until the buildings collapse. And soon, and I've seen pictures recently of like a lot of the buildings are starting to come down. So I heard they're starting to put some restrictions on what you're able to do, how you're able to travel around, and it's a little bit more restrictive than when I was there. So I was very fortunate to have went when I did.
Well, what did you say? We were talking before dinner about the percentage jump in tourists that have been coming out to Chernobyl since the show aired. Did you say some ridiculous percentage that
Yeah, they
tourism
said
had jumped?
it went up. I mean, it spiked dramatically. I think it was a couple 100%. It was like 22,000 went to it. So
Wow.
after the show, everybody went, and that's just because the radiation levels are low enough. It's just what you're allowed to see now might be drastically different than when I was there. I'm sure you could find the right guide that's going to take you and allow you to see whatever you want to see, but going into the buildings and wandering through them, the level of, like, I would guess, destruction that has taken place since 1986 to now with no upkeep whatsoever, and how basically the environment has taken it back over. It's an unstable area, so I think it's very limited to what you can go in and do.
Yeah. So when you were there, were there any specific sites that you saw that had a really profound effect on you?
So I would say the hospital was definitely one. They had a nursery there, and you would see, like, you know, the small beds for the children and stuff.
Do you know, was it a single hospital in Pripyat?
We went into one. I don't know if there was a second. The one we went into was pretty big.
Because I know the big famous thing, right, is that on the actual, when the event was occurring, the night of the event, that's where all the people were being brought,
Right.
as they were still kind of unraveling what was going on. Did you get the sense that that was one of those hospitals where people who were sick with radiation, people that were dying and suffering in the wake of the event had been brought?
Well, yeah, absolutely. There were a number. You still see the beds there. You still see there was like medicine bottles, like the old-fashioned ones, the glass bottles. There was needles and things of that nature, and the larger shots that people would get. The one place we weren't able to go, and that's because of the high radiation, was in the basement of the hospital, and that's because that all the gear from when people were brought in was thrown down there, and the radiation levels were very high. So they did not allow us to go down there. In fact, that was completely blocked off, but walking around the hospital was wide open.
Fascinating. Because I think, as I understand with radiation, and correct me if I'm wrong, it is like particulate, like it's particles in the air that attach to things, and so is that the idea that it kind of settles?
It settles down, and then it's just, there's so much dust over all of it.
Yeah.
And what it was happening so quickly was there was no time to dispose of it. They didn't burn it, or however they would have destroyed it, that would have made sense. It was just thrown into different areas. And there's areas that you can wander around and you might see 1,000 gas masks that have just been discarded, thrown into a corner. And then there were gowns and different things like that. And you can see this is one of the masks that was laying in one of the rooms. There's probably another 1,000 on the floor that they would just come in and out as the rescuers came in and the people escorting others out. They would just take that when they were done with their mask, throw it away, and get a new one.
So these masks you saw hanging around were not just some remnants from the fact that they were living like a Cold War nuclear plant city. These were
worn,
used during
right,
the event.
During the event. And if we go to the next slide, it shows, this was one that was just hanging from the pillar there, but on the next slide, if you could go to that, there's just piles of masks. And in the past, people were taking these and selling them as souvenirs. And that's really why they stopped that and had much more around trying to protect it and make sure that people weren't selling these in small markets and individuals getting sick.
Because the masks are still radioactive.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and when you put like your dosimeter near to those, the radiation goes up quite a bit. So in like this area, we had much higher reads than we had in other areas. And it was really all over the place. Like you could walk into a room where you thought, there's really not much here, but you don't know what might have been there before or what might have gotten moved, and we'd see like the radiation spike.
Was that an eerie feeling when all of a sudden you'd come into a room and I mean, I'm assuming the meter, is it just a visual thing? Does it make a kind of sound?
Yeah, it beeps, and then it also will give you like a dial. It has like the little digital numbers on it.
Yeah.
And you just hold it up to different things, and you can tell what the radiation level is at. So
I mean,
two
it's
is
kind of a
completely
narrative.
safe.
It's as you're taking it around, it's kind of telling a story of its own.
Exactly.
In terms of what happened there and the question marks surrounding like where these numbers are coming from.
Right. And in this one here, this was in one of the rooms at the entertainment complex, and you can see there's probably a couple hundred masks, but there were TVs in there were dolls, there were all kinds of different items that were just thrown in there after the fact, because they were trying to clean it up as much as they could and just have one place to store things, so they would get stacked in a place and then they'd have to find a new one. But the hospital, like I said, the basement, that was massively contaminated.
God, so when
And
you
they
see
were the
these,
first ones brought in.
when you see these famous piles of gas masks or dolls, these are very eerie pictures. That was kind of from the liquidators who came in after the fact and were trying to, in some way, localize, organize, contain all these irradiated items to keep them kind of out of the way? Is that the
Yeah,
sense you got?
as we understood it from the guide telling us is that they chose certain areas to do the dump. So you would have areas that they were going to completely cordon off. There were no people over there, and the fire department and the police department and whoever else was coordinating from the government would have these certain areas where different items that if they were close to the radiation or it could have spiked in the area that they were at, they would then discard that, and it was all taken over to these areas and made into a dump.
Gotcha.
So they were just thrown into the rooms.
And I'm curious, was your guide, what was their connection to the place? I mean, is this the kind of thing where it's local people who have literal familial connections to this event? Are they outside people coming in? What's their kind of take on the events that led to this and kind of the impact it's had on their history?
I mean, it was more adventure tourism. I think that the guide that we had was very knowledgeable about what was going on in Chernobyl and was able to explain things. He had a good knowledge of the roads, where to go, what to see, and then along with our list of what we wanted to make sure we visited, he was able to facilitate that. But he was from Kiev. He didn't have any family connections to it, but just, was involved and, truly understood the history of it. And in, like in Kiev itself, when we would tell people that we were going there, people would always ask why would you ever want to see that? They had no interest in it. And they're like, that sounds terrible. Who would want to even go see that? And that was all we wanted to do when we got there.
Yeah. Did he seem to have any concerns about the amount of time he spends there in terms of exposure and radiation?
No. I believe that he told me that it was like they'd have a 2 or 3 day time frame that they would stay out of the zone. But with all the workers there, when we were there were probably 1,500 workers that would rotate in and out over a couple-week period that were building the sarcophagus that was going to go over the top of it. So there were a lot of people moving in and out. They would move them out for a certain period of time for the radiation to die down if they had, higher doses, and they were probably closer than anyone to it.
And do you know was this kind of an international project, or was it just Ukrainian, or
It was internationally funded. I believe that it probably had engineers from the U.S., Russia, Ukraine, and probably all the European Union.
Yeah.
I think that there were probably most of the workers were Ukrainian or potentially Russians, but there's still problems between the two countries at that time. So probably more of Ukrainians working there, and then engineers were globally.
Very cool. And what was that like, seeing that kind of, because it's got to be a massive structure, right? I mean,
The structure is just, it's massive. Like I said, it could cover a football field. It's just enormous, and they have it on the tracks, and then what it did is it just pushed over the top of it and basically was completely sealed off. So with all these workers, you would see, work trucks going in and out just like a regular day's work.
wow.
They had full fencing around it. You could get up close to reactor 4 to see it, but you couldn't get in. A lot of security guards around there, and then you had probably a couple hundred people working at a time inside.
Wow.
Now, they weren't inside the actual reactor. The sarcophagus was over probably a good, 1/8 of a mile away from it, maybe a little bit closer, where it was constructed, and then it would be just pushed over.
Very cool. And you weren't
And maybe
there.
a little closer.
You weren't there, correct, when they actually pushed.
No, we were there before. It was just finishing the construction of it.
Were there any kind of plans? I'm wondering whether it was a big kind of achievement celebration or whether it was something that was kind of downplayed and kept quiet, this kind of act of pushing this new sarcophagus over.
There was a celebration. I mean, there's a number of statues in town. There's a monument to the firefighters there. There's a monument to the health workers. You know, at the end of this, I know that there were some celebrations that took place when they pushed it over and they've completely contained it. So I don't think it was broadcast widely.
Yeah.
But amongst the people who went through and actually did the work and got it done, it's definitely done a great job to keep the radiation levels lower than they were before.
Yeah.
Especially before it breaks out. That was one of the biggest concerns, is that the radioactive material was not under control. And because of this, they had to put another sarcophagus on it.
Because at the time, they just buried it in sand and concrete.
Sand and concrete dumps is all it was.
Yeah.
What is it now, made of?
Now it's cement and steel is what the building's made of. That's what was pushed over the top of it, but it gives it a much broader coverage, because the original was just dumping it inside as much as they could. And then I think, you know, there's a lot of graphite that was blown out too during the explosion. And during that, like the bringing of the graphite that was the most radioactive parts, they pushed that into one larger hole and that was cemented over. And then this was a secondary, you know, collective protection that was going to be pushed over and hopefully finally seal it.
How did they push the sarcophagus? What was the means of moving it?
What I was told is it was by like a small like locomotive.
Train?
Yeah, that pulled it over the top of it.
Wow, so they had tracks.
They had tracks, and then it pulled it across. And we weren't there. We could just see what they were building and how they were setting it up.
Wow. And so when you were there, is there anything in particular that you did not get to see that if you were ever to go back, you hope you could?
You know, I touched on, like, Reactor 4 was one of the things. There was the graveyard of the trucks, a lot of the buses that took the people out and evacuated people that were contaminated. The fire trucks that were originally used were all put in a large graveyard. We saw them all from a distance. We were able to take pictures of them and get as close as we could. I'd like to go back and investigate that further. If they were still available, I know a number of them were being buried because of the radioactivity that was still on them. But that was a pretty interesting place. Overall, though, most of what we wanted to see in the city of Chernobyl city itself, and then also Pripyat and the reactors, along with the cooling towers, we were able to do.
Yeah.
And that was the nice thing. And the nice thing also was that there just were no people there at the time. I don't know if it was the rain that maybe kept them away or just tourism wasn't that strong, but we were able to pretty much do whatever we wanted.
Very cool. And are there any other particular stories that stand out to you about your experience there?
So if we move ahead, like one of the most eerie spots, if you could move one slide forward, is this. So in April, this started to be set up. It was an amusement park. And they had the Ferris wheel, they had bumper cars, they had a parachute drop, and it was all getting set up for May Day when it happened. And that's probably one of the most eerie sights, because when you pull into it, it's in this larger like parking lot. And the surrounding apartment complexes are right around it, and you could just see people were getting ready to have celebrations.
Yeah.
And all of this was taking place, and it was, you know, a couple days away before this park would open up. And it was really irritating, and I would say this probably stood out the most when I saw it, of like, wow, this is just, you know, just such a bizarre place.
Yeah.
It's like just the other side of the moon. It's just so strange. And wandering around there and knowing what had taken place and how long this had been there. And the Geiger or the dosimeter was definitely going off in this area.
Interesting.
A lot around the metal, a lot of like different mosses and trees, as you could see coming through, like, you know, in this area here with the bumper cars. Just wandering through that area, you could put it down, you could see spikes. But this one really kind of settled in and probably created the best pictures. I would like to return someday, potentially in the winter, because I didn't realize when I first started researching it just how much tree growth there was. You know, to go down the street, sometimes it would be as thin as, and it would be like a, you know, a good small 2-lane road leading into it, and it was a grid pattern that was, you know, laid out by the Soviets, so it was very nice. And you would go down and the trees would be completely across it.
Yeah.
So, you know, you're walking through all this brush, and you didn't get the pictures of the lower areas because of that. So I've seen pictures that have come out during the winter months, and it's pretty spectacular when you can really see it wide open without anything in, you know, impeding your view.
Yeah. So I'm curious, what did you do with all of your clothing after the fact? Because even if it's low level, it had to have been radioactive coming out of that zone, correct?
So this was somewhat interesting. So my buddy and I get back to the hotel in Kiev. We get back late night, probably around 10 o'clock, and we just decide to throw all the clothes away. So we bag everything, we take it out, and there's a dumpster, throw it in a dumpster, shower off, get done and stuff, and we're gonna go out and grab some beers, and it's a couple hours later, grab some sleep, went out for a couple beers, and I don't know, it's like 12:30 or something like that. And when we walked out, there was some homeless guy digging through and taking the clothes. So I'm like, oh my God. So we tried to tell him, and he basically told us to get lost, and I guess he got some clothes, but I don't, hopefully he's okay today.
Shoot. Well, yeah, I mean, I have to imagine if the radiation levels were at least somewhat safe, even by today's standards, and hopefully they weren't as contaminated.
I'm sure. I mean, we tried to talk to the person, but he wanted nothing to do with us. Probably thought, we were going to take him back or something like that.
Yeah.
But, and didn't speak the language, so it was a little bit tough. But, it was mainly the dust and the water that got us in the beginning. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't have thrown the clothes away.
Yeah.
It was just when that ceiling broke through and it just splashed us, that was the time it was like, okay, I'm not keeping these clothes at the end.
Yeah. Did you get to bring your dosimeters back with you? Were there any?
Yep, brought that back.
And so you never took a reading once you were in the hotel to see if your boots were firing off or anything like that?
No, we didn't do that. When you leave though, when you're leaving out of the area, you have to go through a radiation detector. So the military has these things, you go into it, you'll stand, you put your hands up, and they'll take a couple of different pictures and check the dosage. They'll run all of your equipment through like a radiation detector, and then after that, they'll clear you to leave the area.
Oh, okay, very interesting.
So you just don't leave out of there at the end,
Yeah.
you actually go through a full check.
Do they have any kind of like decontamination procedures if somebody was running hot for whatever reason?
They would, yes. Yeah, they had showers in the back and stuff like that. But I think that, the guides, they try to keep you as far away from like where it would be dangerous.
Yeah.
We didn't have anything go off, which was surprising considering the clothes were covered when we got hit with it. But no, you went through that and out the door you went.
Very cool. And then I guess the last main question that I have is, did you get a sense, having been there, what the future of this place is? Because, 1986 is still relatively recent, obviously. I think the idea that this place would ever become a tourist site is probably still surprising to a lot of people. Was there any indication of like what the plans for this place are? Is it the kind of thing where eventually they like to just kind of put it all behind them? They've got this new sarcophagus there that'll hopefully bring radiation levels down. And do you expect that civilization will slowly start to creep back in? Or will it become this kind of living monument to this past event where things are untouched? Or in some cases, you think about some of the great ruins that people go to visit, where these ruins are actively maintained, like temples in Cambodia and stuff, where there's workers there to keep these things standing for people to visit. Is there a world where Ukraine is investing to keeping these structures, these dilapidated structures, standing from collapsing so that people can still visit and see the aftermath of Chernobyl?
I don't think there's any plans for that. I don't think they're going to destroy it. I think they're just going to let nature take its course. I think it's too dangerous. Tourism, like we talked about earlier, has spiked. A lot of people do want to come and see that area, but it's going to be limited more and more just because of just the dilapidated buildings, and the risk of collapse is far too high. So they'll probably leave it as it is. I could picture, as things continue to progress and, they've got, radiation levels coming down, no one is going to be moving back to that area anytime soon. But I think tourism will continue there. I think it's an incredible place to visit. I think it's absolutely should be on a bucket list. It's a great trip, and it's really hits home of like how different this is. It was the largest nuclear disaster that ever took place, and considering the different areas that you can get to and still see, I think that will remain important for them for tourism.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'm sure it'll continue to be an interesting site. We'll have to see what the future holds for it. In the meantime, what's next for you in your travels and adventures?
So my son, for his 18th birthday and graduation, will be heading to Egypt on the 5th of January. We'll look to travel to Cairo, down to Luxor. We'll be diving in the Red Sea, and then we're going to look to see if we could potentially get to Sudan, and we'll just kind of see what COVID does and that'll be the next one on the bucket list. And then I've been looking at a number of other things in Africa, but everything is just so hit or miss right now.
Yeah.
It's too hard to take a bet and look to get everything booked and set, and then all of a sudden it cancels. So this is the first big trip we've taken. I was in Bonaire earlier this year, diving in July, and right before the pandemic, I had motorcycled Pakistan and India, which was spectacular. And right after I got back, it was 2 months later, we went into the pandemic.
Yeah.
And then it was lockdown and real minimal travel.
Shoot. Have any of your family or your kids shown an interest in going to Chernobyl? Is that on their bucket list at all?
No, that has not been on the bucket list.
Yeah.
No. I haven't heard much from them on that one.
And was that an active point of contention at any point, the fact that you were traveling there? Did you get any family members kind of giving you a call saying maybe you should avoid this spot?
No, I don't think so. I think my wife probably checked into my life insurance and kind of wanted to see where those things were. But no, not really. Most of what we were able to explain and what I had read about the low doses of the radiation, it wasn't that big of a worry.
Yeah.
And the short period of time that was spent there, it was well worth everything we did to get there, but it wasn't too much of a point of contention.
So you have no lingering regrets or doubts or worries about your time spent there?
None.
Or any potential repercussions?
No, as of so far, things are good.
There we go.
All right.
All right. Well, thank you, Mike, for coming out to share
Absolutely.
your story with us. I believe we do a Q&A at the end.
Sure.
So if there's any questions, either in the chat or anyone from the audience, I think we have a mic that can go around if David is still in the room.
What was the rating on
Yeah,
your?
wait, hold on, Jim. Let's get you a mic there at the front. Craig, are you good to run that around to people?
Yeah,
Thanks.
just gotta figure out how to turn it on. There you go.
What was the actual rating on the on your device? Was it Rinkens?
Yeah, so yes, I believe, is there another term that's under micro? Rinkets might be it, but I thought it was like micro maceters or something like that. The highest rating I got to, like I said, 2 is pretty much a normal dose. 9 is on an overseas flight. They say 16 is getting a CT scan, and the highest reading I had was about 46.
While in Chernobyl, you got a 46?
Well, in Chernobyl.
But that, I mean, I don't know what the ratings are.
Yeah, and that was like, and that doesn't even like get to where you would need to be to have like true radiation sickness. I believe at 100 is when it starts to become dangerous.
Yeah.
And that was in an area where I was able to go by and there were some masks and I was able to put the dosimeter right in it. That was the highest reading I got.
How many days were you there?
We were there 2 days. We were 1 day inside and then 1 day on the outside where we went to some of the villages. We were hoping to see some people.
Pass that on.
And truthfully, 1 day pretty much will get you what you need to have happen.
How close were you to get to the number 4 reactor? And do you have any idea what the reading was, or what they said that they gave you a reading of the elephant's foot in reactor 4?
So I'm not sure.
So real quick, just
Yeah.
for context, the elephant's foot is kind of the slang term for, I think it's just the pile of melted concrete and sand and boron or whatever that's just kind of amassed on top of what is it? It's like a metal or a concrete pad that existed underneath the reactor. And now there's just this pile of radioactive sludge, I guess, that just lives on top of it that people have called the elephant's foot.
Right. We weren't anywhere near close to that. On the readings, standing where I was with the reactor, I probably took this from maybe, I would guess, 300 yards, 200 yards. We were pretty close. Chain link fence goes right up to around this area, and it wasn't reading that high. Probably in the 3 to 5 range. But then as you go outside of that, there's something called the red forest. And the red forest, the trees, as we went through there, holding the dosimeter even to like the window of the car was registering at 8. And when we stopped in there, we went into the woods and kind of felt around, it was around 13 or 14. So that was one of the more heavily contaminated places on the explosion.
Wow, and so the idea is just radioactive dust still just coming off those trees.
And just what's grown over the years and how it's kind of stayed into the ground.
So is new growth, I mean, do you know, is the new growth that's coming up, is that coming up and growing radioactive, or is it the particles that are still in the soil and the air
I think
that are
it's the
contaminating
particles
it?
that it's picking up as it grows through
Interesting.
that are in the soil. Yeah, it's the soil. Like I had said earlier, like the moss was what really registered the highest. You know, the trees were one thing, but the moss on the ground, when you would put the dosimeter on that, it really went up.
Wow.
So I apologize. Another question here. Do you think that there was a higher reading on plant material or basically non-biological material, like dolls and masks? Was there a difference in reading there that you would think that one was higher than the other?
The masks were the highest, the one where it was collectively in a pile and I was able to put it right up next to it. That was probably the highest reading I got. The next would have been the moss and then the trees. Metal going into like the apartments or putting it on the apartment wall or even on the furniture inside of it really wasn't that high. It didn't move it all that much. It was more of those items that had been absolutely contaminated and were put in that pile, and that dust has probably remained there for, you know, how many years it had been. And then, right, and then the other is, you know, like I said, you know, that moss was probably the most unique thing that would really contain such a high level, showing of how much actually went into the ground as those particles, you know, dispersed.
Hey, I always joke when I see like an oversized piece of fruit, I'll be like, oh, that must have been grown in Chernobyl. But did you see any altered crops at all? I mean, because they must have plants that are still growing and fruit trees that are still growing there.
No altered crops. The plant life was actually very robust. I mean, the trees looked healthy as anything, all fully leaved, you know, was getting towards fall when we were there. But overall, nothing that really stood out. There really was no agriculture or farming in the areas that we went to. Over by the river, there's like a crushed barge that had a lot of growth on it, but nothing in the way of like, you know, vegetables or anything.
Super legumes, huh?
Right, exactly.
Did you get any readings on the water? Is the water still fairly radioactive?
Water, like putting it close to it, didn't do anything.
Even like a lake or ponds?
No, there were a couple
water?
of ponds and stuff, and a river that was through there, or a stream, and there was nothing there.
Wow. I guess that's a good sign.
Yeah.
What happened to people who were evacuated? Were they scattered all over Ukraine and Russia at that time, or were they all kept at a certain area to be monitored for a few months, years after the accident?
From what we were told, the evacuation started, it went to like 3 different towns outside where they placed these individuals. They got placed into large like gymnasiums and basically were monitored for a period of time. But that period of time was very short. And pretty soon they dispersed to other family members or moved across Ukraine and the area around Belarus. They couldn't return to it. Many, you know, were basically desperate. You know, they had to leave everything behind. Mm-hmm. So it was all just a fresh start. So those with family were probably the luckiest. But from what we heard, it wasn't like the containment for them was a long period of time. They say that, you know, many became sick years later. Yeah. And, you know, they put the death toll that could be, you know, close to like 10,000, although only 50 are really truly registered as passing from it. But there was all kinds of deformations and things of that nature that took place with different, you know, childbirths and, you know, just over time with those that were closest to the radiation. Mm-hmm. It wasn't a quick evacuation when it happened. I believe it took 36 hours before they even started rolling people out of there and letting them know what the truth was about the accident.
Interesting side note, a neighbor of mine was a child in Kiev, and apparently a day into it, he got a call, his mom got a call from somebody in New York, like, you better get out of there. And the local government was like, everything's fine. Do you have a question?
Yeah. So, just out of curiosity, because 2017, were you just there as a group or on your own and found your own guide? Because how did you find the guide?
So, went there just with a buddy of mine that I travel quite a bit with. We were researching on the internet. If you pull it up on the internet, Chernobyl tours, you'll find probably 10 different companies that offer these tours. So it wasn't that robust back at that time. Found a company, you tried looking up, are there good ratings for them? Am I going to just get ripped off? These people seem to have the most thorough website, and that's how we found them. And then it was just conversation after conversation, and we took a chance with them, and it really paid off. They did a great job.
And being in that area, do they give you any kind of, because I would imagine a lot of the settling, when you had those kind of radioactive areas over so much time, I would think a lot of things would be on the ground level. So do they advise you have to be careful not stirring things up? Do you wear covered footwear or anything like that? Because that tends to be some of the risk.
No, it was, boots were recommended. I think pretty much you could have went in anything, but boots were absolutely recommended. A lot of times, like if you were to wander around like the backside of a building and you were going through a lot of trees, you were brushing up against different things. I think that was probably the most concerning. We didn't, dig into dirt or anything like that, and that's where probably most of, the particles had landed and there's quite a bit of exposure. So staying away from that, but there's no specifics at the time that I was there of wearing masks or any other kind of coverings.
Wow, that's surprising, being in some of those conditions of those buildings and what you would stir up to at least not have masks on of some kind.
No masks at all, and what was interesting, you get into the individual who was our guide and took us in, we got into his car that, I don't know, he probably uses with his family, and, you're sitting there, you just came through it, you've gotten these particles all over. And now you're sitting in the passenger seat and in the back seat, and, we're driving along and going to a liquor store to get beer on the way back to Kiev. It was just like normal. Running the plant, exactly.
Shoot, all right, any more? I have one more question. Maybe it's kind of a little bit of a morbid one, but were there any gift shops? Did you encounter any Chernobyl? I grew a third leg in Chernobyl.
No, but I did in Kiev find, I found Putin toilet paper, which I bought. And
With his face on it?
With his face on it.
We'll see how long that lasts.
Also they had, it was Hard Rock Chernobyl shirt. That was the only souvenir I saw.
Did you pick one up?
I did.
There we go.
You probably saw toys around too, left behind.
Yeah, children's toys, dolls. A lot of it had been really broken up. Some of the different rooms and apartments, and that was one nice thing about having somebody who knew the area, could tell you, like, if you go down this hall here on the 5th floor, look in these two rooms, they're probably the best, from what it looked like before. And you could see, old appliances and, the toys and things that people just left behind. But you definitely did not want to take anything from the area.
Did they provide you with a Geiger counter, or did you have to bring your own?
I bought my own, yeah. So we each bought one, and then the guide also had one.
Wow. Well, that sounds like a great adventure, Mike. I hope that you're able to get back there at some point, and I hope that anybody who's heard your story and is interested in going themselves feels maybe a little bit emboldened to go and check it out. So thank you so much for coming again to share your story with us. This is my, I think, last night hosting a program here as president, so I feel very honored that you were the last guest I had a chance to kind of welcome and talk through another great adventure. And I hope that everybody here and everybody watching from home will join us next year when we resume our programming. We're here every single Thursday with more great stories of adventures from off the beaten path. So Mike, thank you so much. And everybody, I hope you have a happy holiday, and we'll see you next year.
Thank you.
All right, and Mike, before you leave the stage, we have a little token of our appreciation for you.